Good morning, everybody. I'm Sandra Amor. I'm just recovering from flu, so I'm sorry if I sound a bit like Rod Stewart. What I do is I take sections of people's brains and look at them underneath the microscope, and basically I'm trying to get hold of what's going on. So my partner in crime here is Hans van Noort. He's actually my husband. So you want to stand up? Oh, he's there. Okay. So he's given me the opportunity to do all the talking today. Yeah, typical with my sore throat. But what I'm going to tell you about today is I'll tell you a little story, and at the end of it, I'm going to tell you about, well, I'm not really telling you about some therapy, but Hans is developing a therapy based on what I'm going to tell you today. Okay. I like to think of the damage that's going on in the brains of people with MS, a bit like a forest fire. So here you can see where I've got the active fire on this side. This is when the myelin's being broken down and attacked by the cells. Okay? Here's what we like to say is the active lesion. So that's when the damage is occurring. But you can see here, the damage has already occurred, and it's more or less died out. So this is when the fire's more or less dead. And here's the fire still going on at the edge of the damage. So this is what we call a chronic active damage. And then finally, the fire dies out altogether, and what you're left with is a scar. So this is the scar that gives multiple sclerosis its name. And this is just a reminder for me to tell you, if you haven't already seen the Charcot tapestries at the back of the hall where you had coffee this morning, to try and explain this in a bit more detail, we've made a series of tapestries which we call the Charcot tapestry. So we did a lot of sewing and knitting and basically put things together, and actually there's one here just to try and explain about what we see underneath the microscope. So this is some of my knitting, so I can show you later on. Okay, so the major question then is, if it is a fire, if it's like a fire, what is the spark that sets the fire off? Why does the fire occur? And that's what I'm going to try and tell you today. Here's the nerve cell, and you've all heard of myelin. And this is the cell, the oligodendrocyte, which makes the myelin. And this is what it looks like when we culture it in a Petri dish in the lab. Okay, so it looks very sort of flat. But what it does in the brain, it wraps around the nerve cell to help the transmission go down the nerve. And when it disappears, then obviously you don't get this proper transmission. So that's the oligodendrocyte. Then we have macrophages. Now, I'm looking around the audience. I guess most of you knew about Pac-Man. Hands up those that knew Pac-Man. Yes. Okay. Well, here's Pac-Man. The other group of cells is what we call the macrophages, and they go along and eat up things. So they're responsible for eating up the myelin. And they actually come in different flavors. So some are good and some are bad. And in the brain, these macrophages are basically what we call microglia. So the microglia in the brain are basically the brain macrophages. So these are the cells that I'm going to tell you about today. Now, David Miller just told you about the lesion formation or the damage formation, and it comes and goes all the way through the course of multiple sclerosis. Okay, so I'm not going to tell you about what actually causes MS. I'm going to tell you about what we think causes the start of the lesion or the start of the damage. So the red dots here are the nerve fibers, which people have been telling you about this morning, and the green is the myelin. So I don't know whether you can all see this, but in the middle is a blood vessel, and this is how the damage starts. The macrophages come in, these Pac-Men come in and start eating up the myelin, and this is what we call an active lesion. So this is ongoing. So this is the fire in the beginning, okay? And then the macrophages sort of move out towards the rim. They've eaten all the myelin. It's all disappeared in the middle, plus some of the nerve fibers have been damaged. They carry on eating, and this is what we call the chronic active lesion. And the next stage is those cells disappear, and the scar, other cells come in and form the scar tissue. So this is the scar. Okay, so this is the whole series of events. Now I'm going to go back to the beginning because something happens before the cells come into the brain, okay? These are the microglia, and what they do is they try to sense if there's anything going on in the brain. So basically they're moving around all the time, trying to sense if anything's going to go wrong so that they can signal and call in help. Here's the nerve cell and here's the myelin. So this is in a normal case, healthy case. And in multiple sclerosis, I've done the oligodendrocyte in a slightly different colour and the nerve cell in a slightly different colour because we think that is the trigger. So that something is going wrong with the nerve cell and the myelin to trigger the cells to become activated. And here are the microglia. They've become activated. So they start expressing a molecule on the surface that we can detect as activated. So here they are. Something triggers them to group together, and this is what we call the preactive lesion. So we think this is the spark of what's going on to cause the damage. This is the preactive lesion. And the reason why we think that is sometimes we see in these so-called preactive lesions is some macrophages coming in and starting to nibble at the myelin. So not when the myelin is really destroyed, like in the beginning I showed you, but actually it looks like the macrophages are sort of nibbling at the myelin. And then something triggers the whole series of events to cause this active lesion, to cause the fire to start burning. So what we're doing in the lab is actually looking at these so-called preactive lesions. Here's a preactive lesion. The microglia are expressing this protein that we can detect underneath the microscope. So these lesions occur in normal myelin, in normal, what we think in normal myelin. So there's no myelin damage at this stage. Now the interesting thing about these preactive lesions is that there are quite a lot of them. Now they don't all go to form active lesions, so what we think is some of these preactive lesions disappear again. Otherwise, you would have the whole brain demyelinated, and that's not what happens in multiple sclerosis. So if we look underneath the microscope again, what we're trying to do is trying to figure out why these microglia, these brain macrophages, become activated. And in these preactive lesions, the oligodendrocytes, they're the cells that make the myelin, they look as though they're stressed. And what we've done here is we've stained for a stress protein. So here's in a preactive lesion, these are the oligodendrocytes. They're expressing this stress protein. And the stress protein, we believe, actually activates these microglia. So the green is the stress protein and the red are the activated microglia. And if we look in high power, here are these brain macrophages, and here are the oligodendrocytes. They seem to be sort of nibbling on the oligodendrocyte. Now, the oligodendrocytes don't die at this stage. So we think this is basically a repair mechanism. So the microglia are actually trying to stop the stress. So now this is sort of the end of my story. But I'm going to go over the details again. Here's the oligodendrocyte, here's the neuron, and these are the microglia. So the oligodendrocytes and myelin start to become stressed, and we think that this might be the spark. So if we go back to the analogy with the fire, we think that this might be the spark. The oligodendrocytes, they become stressed. They're going red there, but they don't die at this stage. But what happens is the stress protein that the oligodendrocytes are making trigger the microglia to become activated. And this is what we see. This is the preactive lesion. Now, when things get too bad, when they get too stressed, The microglia can't cope. And what they do is they call in the cells from the periphery. So they call in the macrophages from the blood. They call in the macrophages, and the macrophages then also call in the T cells. So this is the blood-brain barrier. Here here's the T cell. Now, the T cells I'm going to tell you about are basically the T cells that are going to recognize the stress protein. Everybody has them, or the majority of people have T cells directed to this stress protein. And it's the T cells that go in, and the T cells cause the damage. So it's at this stage that the myelin disappears. And it's only in MS where the protein is expressed in the oligodendrocytes in the brain, and that's why the myelin becomes damaged. Now, this is where Hans comes in, because his therapy is geared towards blocking these T cells. So what I've told you about today is the damage occurs very early on, and it occurs basically because the oligodendrocytes become stressed and activate the cells in the brain. And this is supposed to be a protective mechanism. So the macrophages, microglia, become activated to try and stop the stress. And only when the stress gets too bad that the microglia cannot cope, that's when the damage starts occurring, because that's when the microglia have to call in help. It calls in the artillery from the periphery, and it's the T cells and the macrophages coming from the periphery that cause the damage. Okay, well, I hope that was clear. Thank you very much for your attention.